Hello, guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today, I know I've been hyping up a little bit, but we've finally got here part 100. So, this will be the 100th part of our Planet Zoo mod spotlights. We take a look at some of the wonderful mods people will be making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. And I know a lot of you are getting a bit tired of the fish, so we've only got a couple fish today, and the rest going to be all mammals and things like that. So, animals you all really like. So, yeah, happy 100. I wouldn't believe that I'd make 100 of these, but the mods just keep coming, so I just keep covering them, and it's really awesome that people are really loving and modding the game this much, so you can have so many cool species. So, anyway, let's get started. So, we're going to be starting off with the red drum that comes from Leaf, Buff Sue, and Fishing Planet. So, have one swimming around here. So, the red drum, these guys are a type of drum or croaker. So these are a relative of the South American silver croaker, as I mentioned a little while ago. These guys are definitely a marine species. They're typically found in brackish waters or oceanodromias, so they migrate to different parts of the ocean as well. And they like a depth range of. They typically found in water more than 10 meters deep, and they're considered a subtropical species. And they typically live across the western Atlantic, so they can be found as north as Nova Scotia, down into Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Antilles as well, and then can be found in the southern Caribbean coast and down from the Orinoco Delta and into Argentina. So quite a tall and long range for these guys, because these guys are really cool. So these guys are also quite a long species. These guys can get to a maximum length of about 170 centimeters, max length, and but though a common length is typically about 50 centimeters long, so quite a good average size, decent sized fish. Their maximum published weight is about 51.3 kilograms, so a hefty fish. And they have a maximum age reported of up to 43 years. So, again, quite a long lived fish and still really awesome. So, you can see here they've got the silvery grey to very dark colour to them, and these dark bands as well, which is really cool. And this disappears with growth and things like that. These vertical bands will lessen over time. And they also have these quite interesting jaws and these small barbels, if you can kind of see here, that they use to help detect things in the water as well. They've also got this small spot, as you can kind of see on their tail there. And these guys are really cool. So these guys in their habitat, they're typically found usually over like sand or salty mud bottoms and coastal waters and things like that, especially in areas where there's large river runoff. And juveniles can be often seen in estuaries, and these guys will typically feed on crustaceans, mollusks, and fish. They're also considered least concern, and so they're pretty much doing pretty well. Awesome species, though obviously things like climate change, overfishing can be a big impact on these guys. And yeah, they're quite a common commercial fish. People do like eating them. They're also quite a common game fish as well. People like fishing for them. They also can be found in public aquariums as well. Since they're such a big fish, most people wouldn't have these in their tanks, especially since they're saltwater as well. But they can be found in public aquariums. So a really awesome species there. So now we're moving on to another cool species here. So we've got next one was done by Leaf Buff Sue in 1, 2, 3 3D free 3D models. We've got here the Murray Cod, which is a very cool animal that we get to talk about here. So the Murray Cod, these guys are a large predatory freshwater fish from Australia. These guys are a type of perch. Although they're called a cod, they're more closely related. They're not related to like kind of the marine cod, which is really interesting. They can also be called things like the Murray perch, the Queensland freshwater cod. They've got all sorts of different names to them. So yeah, these are really cool fish. These are a large. They've got a large grouper-like bodies. You can kind of see here. They look like a grouper, but they're not that closely related to them. They've got that wide head, and they've got very needle-shaped teeth as well, which is also very interesting. And they have a spiky dorsal fin, as you can see here, but it's not very high. And they've also got this really interesting color to them. You can see they're kind of like yellowish or yellow-greenish with our little splotches and stuff hanging around them. And they've got these angular fins that go around them, things like that. And they are white to cream on their belly surface, but then they kind of splotch pattern, then yellow, greenish to olive on the top there, and it looks like a molten pattern, which is really, really interesting. And these guys, typically, that will change a lot. Murrays from freshwater that are habitats that are quite clear, they'll often have much more like a straight kind of coloring, so they'd be much more distinct, like top side and bottom side. But other habitats where it's a lot more closed, they'll have mottled patterns going down them, which is pretty cool. So these guys are also a pretty large fish. The adult size reaches about 8 to 200, 80 to 100 centimeters, or 31 to 39 inches long, but they're capable of growing well over that, well over a meter. And the largest on record was about 1.8 meters long, or 5'9", and about 113 kilograms, or 249 pounds. And sadly, these large breeding adults are typically quite rare in ecosystems because of overfishing. And as I mentioned, their taxonomy, these guys are not that closely related to cod, truly, but these guys are kind of their own kind of cool little thing. There's some other species that's kind of been described from them, like the eastern freshwater cod and the Murray River cod, so they've been split into a couple different species. And in terms of their habitat, these guys can be found after the Murray River, after the Murray-Darling Basin, which is in eastern Australia, which is the largest river system in Australia. It's typically around like Victoria, New South Wales, and even up into Queensland, some parts of it. And it drains to about 14% of the continent and is quite big and obviously able to house these quite large fish. And Murray cod actually died out in many of the upland habitats due to overfishing, damming, and um, things like blocking migrations, things like that, and also trouts, which has caused competition for juvenile Murray cods, which is very sad. But they're also quite long lived, luckily. So they kind of live for a long time. There's been estimates of animals. The oldest recorded cod was about 48 years of age, but there's larger specimens that could be up to 70 years or more. So very long-lived species, so they can produce a lot of babies. In terms of diet, they'll eat pretty much anything smaller than them. They'll eat golden perch, eel-tailed catfish, smelt, goldfish, carp, and introduced fish, things like that. Yabbies as well, Murray crayfish, and they've even been known to eat ducks, cormorants, freshwater turtles, water dragons, snakes, mice, and frogs. So basically, they're on that seafood diet. If they see food, they'll eat it. So that's pretty awesome. In terms of reproduction, these guys are pretty interesting. They reach sexual maturity about 4 to 6 years of age, but generally about 5 years, and it is dependent on that age, and they will slow their growth rate as they reach sexual maturity. But large Murray cods get 15 to 25, 35 kilogram range. These guys are very important breeders, and larger fish can produce larger larvae and things like that, but these guys often are low enough to stay under the radar to breed. Female Murray cod, once they reach sexual maturity, they have egg counts of 10,000, but very large females can have like 80 to 90,000, and a very large specimen that was 33 kilograms had 1,100,000 viable eggs, which is pretty cool. And these guys will spawn in the spring, and usually they use the photo period or the daylight length to judge it, and then they will obviously lay their eggs and fertilize them, and then they hatch. And the young pod will feed in like zooplankton and small like macroinvertebrates and things like that until they get big enough to start eating bigger things until they get to the big adults, which is really, really awesome. And latest research has showed that these Murray cod can live their entire life cycle within the main channel of a stream, though they don't really need to migrate, but they do sometimes. And spawning is usually like precedented by like upstream migrations and flows and things like that, but typically it just depends on the habitat and things like that. In terms of conservation, they were actually originally quite common, and some fishery departments almost saw them as like just endless. But due to being a very large and long-lived fish, these guys were often hunted severely, and now they're considered vulnerable. And they were taking so much out of the river, they basically couldn't keep up. So, like in the early 1800s or the early 1900s, these guys lots of them, they were caught in large numbers for both recreation and for commercial food. But now it's after the 1920s, you can't do that anymore just because there's not enough in the not enough of the fish. But yeah, really, really awesome species. There's been effects because they're so large. They're a very important predator. These guys have adapted to the natural flow patterns, things like that, and sometimes blocking dams and things like that have affected their breeding, which is not good. Also, thermal pollution, where artificial reduction in water temperatures has caused the water to basically get too cold for them as well. Black water events are another bad thing. Is when floodplains kind of get lots of leaf litter, and it can impact a flood event, and this can be bad for these guys. And also physical barriers such as dams and things like that. Pollution as well, such as like runoff, agriculture, introduced carp, overfishing. That's all really hurt their populations. But in terms of their conservation as well, they're considered vulnerable, and they can be harvested in aquaculture, and there have been efforts to reintroduce kind of aquaculture-born fish into rivers. So there is conservation effort for these guys, which is really awesome. And I just think they're just such cool fish. And they've been used as fish meal and fish oil for food, and a better wild fish into farm fish out ratio than things such as salmon and trout, things like that. Since it's a natural habitat, they tend to survive quite well. But yeah, really, really awesome species. They are considered vulnerable, as I mentioned, in Australia, but I believe in general they consider least concerns. And there's good conservation programs in aquaculture producing lots of these guys to go out into the wild. So that's pretty awesome. So yeah, that's our Murray Cod here that was done by Leaf Buff Sue and 123 3D models. Next up we have got here, we've got the Black Marlin. So the Black Marlin, these guys are a species of marlin that are typically found in tropical and subtropical areas of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. See if we can find one swimming out in the water there. Should be out there. There we are. It's a really, really cool species, as you can see. They're one of the largest marlins and actually one of the largest bony fish as well, so they're quite big. Size estimates get to about 4.5 meters or 15 feet long and about 750 kilograms or 1,650 pounds. And that makes them one of the largest marlin and one of the largest bony fish. And they're also among the fastest, but often their speeds can be greatly exaggerated, with recent research suggesting that their true fastest speed is about 36 kilometers per hour or 22 miles per hour. And yeah, that makes them really, really cool. And you can see that you can tell the difference between white marlins and sailfish. These guys are much more solid than their blue marlin counterparts. They have a shorter and rounder bill as well, and they often have the right pectoral fin is often like really held like that, which is another thing that distinguishes them. And is usually pressed flat against their side and used to reduce drag. So pretty awesome. And also you can see they're much darker than other species of marlin. And these guys are also found, as I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific, tropical, subtropical, but they're uncommon movements, and there have been rare reports of them in the Atlantic, which is so that they've pretty much got a widespread distribution. And in terms of their global population, stuff like that, these guys will eat things like various fish and cephalopods. They'll eat tuna, mackerels, snake mackerels, flying fish, squids, crustaceans, octopus, etc., etc. So pretty much a generalist in that regard. And they're also fished commercially, and they're also a highly prized game fish. And they've actually been known to drag boats, Moldovan fish boats in ancient times, like out into the open sea until they got tired, and then they'd have to row back if they caught the fish, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, very, very interesting black marlins. I do quite like them. And yeah, they're considered data deficient just because we don't know much about their fisheries. They're a very open ocean species, and really the only times people see them is when they're out fishing for them. But yeah, it's still a really, really awesome animal. I do like these guys very, very much. So yeah, next we're going to be moving on to another one that was done by Jen, Leaf, and Buffsu as part of the aquatic pack, which is also very awesome. So next one was done by Leaf, Buffsu, and Ghostleaf Fail. We have got the poor Beagle Shark. So you guys love sharks, we've got the poor Beagle. Really, really cool little shark here. Look at this guy. So this is the poor Beagle. These guys are a species of mackerel shark, and these guys can be found in the temperate marine waters of the North Atlantic and the Southern Hemisphere, and they've also been found in the North Pacific as well. In the North Pacific, they're kind of replaced by the salmon shark, but they're still quite cool. So these guys are quite a large species as well. These guys are like very similar to most other species of shark. They've got that sharp counter shading and all that, and they've got that quite long body, things like that. They've also got that dictating membrane. They're also quite a good size. There's believed to be maybe about like 12 feet long, but there's uncertain. A typical length for this guy is about 8.2 feet or 2.5 meters, with females typically growing larger than males of the North Atlantic, and they can get up to maybe about 3 meters in females, so that's kind of a big female's about 9 to 10 feet long. And Southern Hemisphere sharks are typically smaller, but the sexes are similar in size, with 2 to 2.1 meters or 6.6 to 6.9 feet long. And most bull beagles weigh about 135 kilograms or 298 pounds, while a record is being about 510 pounds or 230 kilograms, found in Scotland in 1993. So quite a big species. And you can see their shape's not too dissimilar from most other species of shark. They've got that counter shading, they've got that very long shape to them, large tail, large dorsal fin, the Turner, large teeth as well. Very, very interesting. As I mentioned, Turner, their distribution, they're pretty much almost found all across the world. They're the absent from the North Pacific because of the salmon shark. That they can be found pretty much Indo-Pacific everywhere. They can be found Queensland, New Zealand, South Africa, Bermuda, Scandinavia, like pretty much anywhere that's subtropical and temperate that doesn't have salmon sharks and is not frozen. You'll find these guys, or land, I'll say. But these guys prefer offshore fishing banks, which are preferred habitat that can be found at depths of up to 1,360 meters, and these ocean basins and things like that, all over the water column. So they do kind of like that more open water, which is really, really cool. And in terms of their biology, these guys are fast and energetic fish that can be found either in by themselves or in small groups. And you can see they've got very cool adaptations like their keels and their crescent-shaped tail, that they are very fast sharks. So these adaptations are very similar to other types of sharks, tunas, and billfish. And the salmon shark in it are actually the thickest body members of their family, and they're the swiftest swimmers, so they can swim the fastest pretty much of most other sharks, which is pretty cool. And they're also known to actually take part in play behavior as well. There have been reports off the Cornish coast that these guys will wrap themselves in kelp fronds near the surface and kind of use it to play and things like that, which is really, really cool. And in terms of predation, these guys may be preyed upon by killer whales and great white sharks, though we don't really know that. But they have been recorded of an individual from, I believe, Argentina with bite marks from a copper shark, and they've also been obviously afflicted by tapeworms, things like that. So these guys are quite an active predator. These guys feed on small to medium-sized bony fish. They can take down like mackerels, herrings, groundfish, redfish, cod, sand, lumpsuckers, flatfish. They'll also eat cephalopods and particularly squid, also spiny dogfish, smaller sharks, things like that. They'll also eat mollusks, crustaceans, and carnoderms. And they have been found with things like small stones, feathers, and garbage in their gut, which is pretty interesting. And in the west and northern Atlantic, these guys will pretty much eat mostly pelagic fishes and squids in spring, and then ground fish in the fall. And they kind of have their different pattern depending on what's available, which is pretty interesting. And in terms of their life history, let's see if we can get you guys swimming around. Let's see if we can find another one that's not quite so beaten up, so you can get a good look. Well, this one's good. Let's have a look at you. So, in terms of their reproduction, these guys largely is dependent on both hemispheres and give an offset about 6 months. And the suggests that this reproduction is actually quite affected by day length and temperature because the northern and southern hemisphere breed at different times, which is pretty interesting. The gestation period typically is about 8 to 9 months, and they actually don't find too many there's no mating grounds around like the western North Atlantic and off Newfoundland and places like that. But they have a single functioning ovary and 2 functional uteri, and they reproduce properly every year, with a typical litter of about 2 to 4 embryos, things like that. And they're also aplacental viviparous, and the main way these babies get food is that the mother will lay a bunch of eggs, and a couple of them will be fertilized, and then the babies in the womb will kind of eat these unfertilized eggs once the yolk is depleted, which is pretty interesting. And typically, at about 20 to 21 centimeters long, the embryo will appear pink. And then once they get bigger and bigger, these guys will start to shed its fangs and get a little bit bigger. And then they basically are born at about 58 to 67 centimeters long, but they do not get more than 5 kilograms at that size, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, really, really cool. It's estimated that their maximum lifespan is about 30 to 40 years in the Atlantic, but in the South Pacific, they could potentially live up to 65 years. But most places, they typically live between 12 and like 20 years or something like that. So yeah, kind of a longer lived fish, which is really, really cool. And also in terms of thermoregulation, these guys are endothermic. So these guys have metabolic heat that is generated through the red muscles in their body and then pretty much held in their bodies through concurrent heat exchanges, things like that. So their body, their large muscles are able to make that heat and retain that heat, which is really, really cool. Also in terms of human interactions, well, often, obviously they're feeding now, but we'll just speed through. I'll just wait for these guys to get back to the water. There we are. So in terms of their human interactions, these guys don't very often bite people, but they've attributed 3 bites to poor beagle sharks, and also 2 on boats. There was 1 provoked and none fatal. So these guys are pretty safe for people. But one thing as well that these guys, because they're hunted for their meat and fins, for obviously shark fin soup, they're under very heavy fishing pressure. And these guys have a wholesale price of like €5 to €7 a kilogram, which is 4 times that of other species. And They became scarce in a lot of areas with annual catches, things like that, and obviously being a larger and slow breeding species, having to breed yearly, things like that, often these species decline because they just can't be sustained. That fishing cannot be sustained. But there's rapid collapses of both sides of the North Atlantic as well. They have been considered vulnerable. I believe they're generally considered vulnerable. Yep. So they are considered vulnerable because there's still a lot of them, but there is and protections in place. But they're a species that if you harvest too much, that's very easy for populations to decline since they are a kind of mid-level predator, and they also breed slowly, so that puts them at risk. See, in most places they're doing okay. There are slight catch limits and things like that, but really, really awesome species. I do really like these guys, who now cannot love a poor Beagle Shark. They're very, very cute. I do like these guys very much. This guy was done by Leaf Buff Sue and Ghost Leaf Fail. I believe they say that. So next, moving on, back onto land. We have enough of fishies today. We're moving with some marsupials. We do love some marsupials. So we got here today the woolwoy, also known as the brush-tailed betong. If you guys want to, if you can't say woolwoy or the woolly, let me say that. These guys are a very small and sadly critically endangered gerbil-like marsupial from the scrublands and forests of Australia. These guys are a member of the rat kangaroo family, and as a marsupial, they carry their babies in their pouches. And as we get to the conservation, we'll talk about why they're endangered. So they were typically split into two subspecies, and one of them is extinct because they used to live down south. And the common name woolly or woolwoy, we'll say like that. That sounds very Australian to me. It comes from the Nulungar language, which is a group of Aboriginals, and these guys are kind of revered in Australia. People do like them. So you can see they're quite a small kangaroo. They get the name rat kangaroos because they're quite small. They dig for fungus during the night, and they usually maintain a solitary range around a central nest. And the length of the head to the body combined is about 310 to 380 millimeters, so about a foot long, and entirely covered in this ground black fur, things like that. And they have like this greenish brown with the upper parts as well, with the pelt. And then they have a tail that's basically that similar length with this rufous color. So that's where they get their name, kind of the brush-tail betong, because they've got a quite hairy tail, which is pretty interesting. And they resemble the burrowing broody or the burrowing betong, although the woolly is typically paler. And these guys also muzzles a lot longer or more pointed than the broody or the burrowing betong, but is less than the Gilbert's portaroo, which is pretty interesting, though they share a range. So in terms of their habitat, these guys, as I mentioned, they're critically endangered, but they used to be quite common. They used to be found in a wide variety of habitats. They could be pretty much found across western and southern, and even there was like two populations from Perth and into Western Australia. I mean, Eastern Australia, and then there's another population in kind of northwestern Australia that they lived. Two kind of isolated populations with some mix in between, of course. They used to be quite common in these places. They're Western Australia, Victoria, New South Wales. They're going to be found in Western Australia, places like that. But very much sadly, these guys, due to people introduced things like stoats, well, not stoats in Australia, foxes and cats, and people introduced competition in terms of rabbits. This caused their populations to crash, and they've basically just incredibly declined across most of the places they live, and they've been even being considered extinct in Western Australia, which sucks. And the last sighting of a woolwoy in Western Australia was in kind of 1912, and it's believed that European rabbit may have also put populations to pressure. They may have suffered from the expansion of agriculture, things like that. Red foxes and feral cats hunted them, and they're pretty much now extinct over most of their range. There's only two kind of indigenous populations of the woolwoy today, found in Western Australia, things like that. But there's lots of conservation work going into these guys, which you guys would love to hear. So, in terms of their diet, these guys are typically frugivores, so they feed on a wide variety of fruits, but they will eat tubers, insects, and they'll even eat resins and things like that, even lots of fungi. Fungi is a very important part of their diet, and they'll often eat a lot of that as well. And they'll actually eat like lots of different types of fungi during like the autumn and summer seasons as well, which is really, really interesting. And they have these certain amino acids and high protein, and they're quite fatty as well, so it's quite good for these little betongs to eat a lot of fungi, which is pretty cool. They've also been observed eating large seeds from the Australian saddlewood, which is nutritious food, and these guys will often play an important role in kind of commercially, in kind of spreading out these seeds, which is really cool. And these guys also, the Australian saddlewood is a very commercially valuable tree, so this could be a really good way to help the conservation. With more trees, obviously, Betong's helping spread them out, but we obviously need to sort out the cats and stuff first. But yeah. In terms of their ecology, these guys were first found in European settlers in rural Western Australia, and they were used for meat during the early colonial period, although they did not really persist among them. They once basically they got set up, they didn't really eat them. But native predators for these guys include the wedge-tailed eagle, but they're preyed upon by red foxes and feral cats, which are not good. And control in certain areas has really helped the species, and predator-free areas where these guys can be released safely is very important for these guys. Is this a baby? No, it's an adult. I want to get in. I can't get close, can I? Let's see if we get this one. There we are. So, yeah, these guys are natural excavators, and they're often dubbed an ecosystem engineer by one researcher because they can move actually 6 tons of soil annually as they look for food. And they dig up soil, looking for seed beds and creating new seed beds for seeds to grow. Also, spores for fungi as well. So they're quite important for keeping the bush healthy, which is pretty awesome. So in terms of their behavior, these guys are also largely nocturnal. They rest during the day and emerge during dusk rather than sunset, and though they're not very strictly nocturnal. And they also breed all year round if the conditions are favorable. So as we look at these cute little babies here, let's see a cute little baby. Let's see if we can find the other one. There's another one around here, I think. There we are. Little baby betongs, quite cute. They're fertile at about 6 months of age, and they give birth every about 3 months. And their wild lifespan is about 4 to 6 years. So they are kind of live fast, die young. And they build this dome-shaped nest with a shallow scrape under the bush and curl up, and they look for bedding materials, things like that. And a species also behaves in a characteristic way when disturbed in a nest. So they'll leave this site with an explosive noise, or they'll hop away and kind of use this motion to kind of escape from predators, which is pretty interesting. There's a very interesting little fight going on here. Look at these cute guys. Not happy. Let's see if we can find a female that's chilling. Anyway, really, really cool. So, these guys do have kind of a big range. Studies that show open woodland suggest that for a nest site, it can be 15 to 28 hectares for a female and 28 to 43 for a male. And the current central range is about 4 to 6 hectares. And that's where they typically like. So they're large, like 40 to 28 or size range is kind of for foraging and then looking for mates, and then the central range is like 4 to 6 or even 3 hectares where they find their central nest, which is pretty interesting. So in terms of their conservation, these guys during the late 20th century, there have been lots of concentrated efforts into reintroducing woolies, into their former sites, and after controlling their red foxes and things like that. There's been places such as the Australian Wildlife Conservancy creating the Caramata Sanctuary as well. There's also been the Mallee Woodlands and Cliffs, places like that. Also New Haven and the part of Western Australia. There have been lots of introduction efforts to large fenced sanctuaries as well, so that protects them. Because these large fenced sanctuaries are a large area and they also are free from cats and foxes and things like that, they are able to pretty much thrive in there, which is really, really cool, and it really gives us a way to like have a protected area for populations to start up. And often these populations will be moved around between other fenced sanctuaries, so you get a lot of genetic diversity in that. So really, really cool. And they're considered a keystone species, so they're one of the species that a lot of places are really wanting to introduce and help bring the populations up because they are quite important for the ecosystem. And they're just quite cute. How can you not love these little betongs? I think they're quite awesome. Or the woolies, woolies, I keep saying. But yeah, really, really awesome. Really cool to get some more Aussie animals in here. So this brush-tailed betong was done by Leaf and Megarex Gaming. And we're also moving on to another cool Aussie animal here. We've got the quail. So the eastern quail, technically. So this is the eastern quail done by Frazzle64, back at again. So these guys are only found in Australia, and they're also formerly known as the eastern native cat, though they're not a cat. These guys are a type of marsupial. They're a carnivorous marsupial, so related to things like other quolls and Tasmanian devils as well. So They've been considered extinct on the mainland of Australia since the 1960s, but they have been introduced into a few different fence sanctuaries, and more recently into the wild as of March 2018, and one of the six extant species of quolls. So these guys are a decent size. These get to a size of about a small domestic cat, with adult males weighing between 53 and 66 centimeters, or 21 to 26 inches in total length, with a 20 to 28 centimeter or 7 to 11-inch tail, and get to about a kilogram. With females being a little bit smaller and a little bit under like 1.5 pounds or 0.7 kilograms, with a body length of 48 to 58 centimeters or 9 to 3 inches, and a 17 to 24 centimeter tail or 6 to 9-inch tail. And you can kind of see they're very interesting there. They've got the short legs, erect ears, things like that, and they only have 4 toes rather than 5, and they lack the hylux, or that fifth toe, which is pretty interesting. They also have, you can see, they have quite a thick coat with these spots along them, which can either be light fawn or near dark black. You can see this kind of the dark black population. And both fawn and black individuals can be found in the same litter, though the surviving populations represent about 3 more times more the former than the latter. So typically, fawn individuals are much more common than black individuals because of these forming the population that is survived from obviously hunting and their declines, but still really awesome. And females will also have, because they're a marsupial, they have a very small pouch that has a lateral fold of skin, and these pouches can be enlarged during the breeding season and has 6 to 8 teats, which is only become functional once the young attaches to them, and regress again when they leave the pouch. And as with quolls, the male actually bears a really weird fleshy appendage on his penis as well. And another really cool thing about these guys is the larger intestine of the eastern quoll, they have no caesium, and they have no divide between a colon and a rectum, which is also pretty interesting. And yeah, in terms of these guys' habitat, let's have a look at the fawny ones while we talk about. There's a fawny one. So, in terms of their habitat, these guys are typically found across southeastern mainland Australia and eastern coast of South Australia. That's where they were found. They're most of Victoria, New South Wales as well, and even Adelaide. But they've become functionally extinct in the early 1960s in mainland Australia, but they remain widespread on the Barbary Islands in Tasmania. And in Tasmania, they live in open rainforest, alpine areas, and scrub, though they do prefer dry grasslands and forest mosaics. So that's pretty interesting. And these guys are a solitary hunter, so these guys will hunt at night looking for small insects, more mammals, birds, and reptiles. They've been known to scavenge food from Tasmanian devils as well, and they even prey itself for Tasmanian devils and musk owls. And that implies that they are nocturnal. These guys are quite a nocturnal species. They can spend their day resting in the burrows, although they may use hollow tree trunks or natural crevices. And they have these simple burrows with like one entrance, but sometimes they can be more complex with one or more nesting chambers which are lined with grass. And each individual has a number of dens, but usually no more than 5 that they use in different times during their range. And being solitary, they tend to avoid each other, although pairs of females can be encountered. And a typical home range for a quoll is about 35 hectares, or about 86 acres, or about 44 hectares, 110 acres for males. So females, like males, have their little bit larger ones so they can find females. And that actually increases dramatically during the breeding season, so males can go out for females. And territories are scent marked, or the dung is distributed randomly rather than specific latrines. And adults also warn off intruders by making like coughing sounds and hissing sounds, also like a shriek that can be an alarm call. And if intruders are fail to leave quickly, then they'll wrestle and fight each other and kick each other as well. And mothers will often have softer calls that they use to maintain contact with their babies, which is also very interesting. So in terms of reproduction, let's see if we can find a little baby here. No, that's an adult. Let's see if we can find a baby. Where's the baby? Here's the baby. Little baby. So in terms of reproduction, these guys breed in early winter. The estrus cycle lasts about 34 days, although most individuals mate during the first cycle of the year. Female can give birth to up to 20 young, and after a gestation period of 90 to 24 days, these obviously will be gestated and be born. And after that, they will attach themselves to the available teat, and they'll be only survivors. And then the young will remain on the teat for about 60 to 65 days and begin to develop fur about the 51st day and open their eyes on the 79th day, and they're fully weaned at about 150 to 165 days. They reach sexual maturity in their first year of life, and they can live up to 7 years in captivity. So in terms of their conservation, these guys are considered endangered because they're extinct on the mainland, mainly due to disease and predation from introduced predators such as feral cats and red foxes. And now, because they've been able to survive in Australia due to the lack of foxes, and also devils have kept populations of cats and ferals, feral cats and foxes down, so that's why they're considered endangered, and still survive in Tasmania. The last mainland population was considered, the last mainland quail was actually collected in 1963, but luckily there's been park services, there's been sightings since like 1999, even a species reported in 2006, but they may be of the spotted tail quail, but most of them are extinct. But they have been reintroduced, a small population in the Mulligan's Flat Woodland Sanctuary in Canberra, and they have been obviously trying to reintroduce them into the mainland and introduce into national parks and things like that. And due to controls of foxes and cats, that allows them these guys to survive a little bit better, which is really really awesome. We want to see more eastern quolls on the mainland. How can you not love these guys? Frazzle did a really wonderful job. It's nice to see Frazzle back with the mod again. So next we're moving on to next one is done by Leaf and Jen. We have got the Roe Deer, or the Western Roe Deer, because there are two species of Roe Deer now, as we'll get into. So this is the Roe Deer, also known as the roebuck. These guys are a species of deer, as you can see. They're a smallish deer, like a reddish to grey brown, and they're adapted for these cold environments. The Western red Roe Deer is typically found in Europe. They can be found in Mediterranean to Scandinavia, to Scotland, to the Caucasus, and eastern to northern Iran and Iraq. So quite a widespread species. In terms of the taxonomy, as I mentioned, these guys have been split into two species. So these guys are the western and the eastern, or the Siberian roe deer is kind of live more in Siberia and Eastern Asia and things like that. Quite different between them. And there are hybrid populations, things like that, especially due to population increases. But generally, they kind of split into those two species. And they're actually more closely related to moose and reindeer, which is pretty interesting. Um, and although they were once classified as a cervarine, these guys are now classified as the Olosonidae, which is the deer from the New World. So pretty interesting. Um, they're more classified, as mentioned, moose and reindeer. In terms of their description, these guys are a relatively small deer. They get to a body length of 95 to 135 centimeters, or about 3 foot to 4 foot 5 inches tall long throughout their range, with a shoulder height of about 63 to 67 centimeters, or about 2 feet tall, a little over 2 feet tall. And they reach a weight of about 15 to 35 kilograms, or 35 to 75 pounds. And there are differences in populations, like some from the Urals or Kazakhstan will be larger, other populations will be smaller, for example, things like that. In healthy populations, their density is obviously restricted by predators, with bucks being slightly larger than does. In other conditions, males can be similar in size or slightly smaller to the females. So bucks, as you can see here, that are in great condition, they develop antlers that can be up to 20 to 25 centimeters long, or 8 to 10 inches, and they have 2 to 3 and really even 4 points, as you kind of see here. And when the male antlers begin to regrow, they have a thick, thin layer of velvet, which disappears after their hair's blood supply is lost. And males may actually speed up the process of removing this velvet by the antlers off trees, so they can obviously use it for duels and stuff in the breeding season, which is pretty interesting. So, yeah. In terms of their habitat, within Europe, they can be found pretty much everywhere, except for the most northernmost parts of Scandinavia and Norway, and other smaller areas. In Iceland, Ireland, they can't be found, and Iceland as well. But typically, they can be found pretty much everywhere. Found in Belgium, they've been found in Britain. They have actually expanded a lot in Britain. They've actually the increase in population actually has been affecting woodland ecosystems, so they're kind of something that's considered too much. And there have been some areas that have been extirpated in England because of hunting and agriculture, which has reduced their habitats. But luckily, they're still completely absent. Not luckily, but they're still absent in Wales in some areas, and they now can really only be found in rural England for like southeastern Kent and parts of Wales. Though anywhere in the UK it maintains suitable for roe deer may have a population, pretty much. So they're kind of commonish. They're quite common in Iran as well, the Netherlands, things like that. Pretty much everywhere. But these guys are quite generalist. They prefer a large amount of habitats. That they include open agricultural areas and things like that. That they retreat to dense woodlands to rest, but they're very opportunistic and they'll often use hedgerow and things like that as well. Deer in the southern Czech Republic almost lived in almost completely agricultural land as well, and they're most likely to be spotted in places near or around forests, so they can retreat to there. And they're also considered a pioneer species. So when farming humans began to colonize the Middle East, the roe deer was abundant. So they took advantage of the woodlands and forests that were created by these Neolithic farmers. So very interesting how animals kind of help each other move around and things like that. In terms of their behavior, these guys are a bit of a mitigate risk. These guys will find these refuge habitats or live in forest during the day and venture into open habitats during the night or during crepuscular periods where there's less activity, where they'll make a leaf litter in beds like that as well. When alarmed, they'll make a bark much like a dog and flash their white rump patch. And they differ slightly between the sexes, with the males kind of having a heart shape and females having a females having a heart shape and males having a kidney shape as well. And they also make these barking and grunting sounds as well, which is pretty interesting to mark their territories. And in terms of their diet, they typically feed on grasses, leaves, berries, shoots. They particularly like young, tender grasses with high moisture content, i.e., grass that has been rained on the day before. And they do not generally venture into a field that has or had livestock in it, so they generally tend to avoid livestock. Let's see, look at these babies here. Look how cute these guys are. So in terms of reproduction, these guys may clash over territory during the early summer and mate during the early autumn. And during the courtship, when the males chase the females, they often flatten the underbrush, which leaves actually areas called row rings, leaving behind these areas, which is pretty interesting on the figure eight. And males actually use their antlers to shovel around fallen foliage and things like that to attract a mate. And roebucks will enter a rutting interprincess period during July and August, and the females will have displayed implantation until give birth in following June, and they typically have a 10-month gestation period, where typically two fawns of opposite sexes can be born, and the fawns remain hidden in these kind of low grasses from predators, and they suckle from their mother about several times a day for around 3 months. And the young female roe deer can begin to reproduce when they're about 6 months old. And during the mating season, male roe deer may mount the same roe deer several times over different hours and things like that. So that's pretty interesting. In terms of the population ecology, they live for about 20 years, so not extremely long lived, but they usually don't live that long. A normal lifespan for them in the wild is about 7 to 8 years, or even up to 10 years. And they often are extremely fecund, and they can double their population every year. But often, sometimes when there's nutrition, things like that, populations will crash and grow. So their populations can kind of be all over the place depending on where you are. And they're also main prey for things such as the Persian leopard, and they're considered, compared to other herbivores and omnivores in places like Iran, these guys are actually a poor disperser of seeds, despite consuming more of them, which is pretty interesting. In terms of uses, these guys are a great game animal and have quite economic value in Europe. They produce a large amount of meat and sports hunting as well, with some 2.5 million roe deer basically shot per year in Western Europe around 1988. In Germany alone, 700,000 were shot during the 1990s, but it's insufficient to slow down the population growth, so they're doing quite well, and they're a main source of venison as well, and game meats, things like that. So yeah, pretty interesting. And they're increasing around Europe, so they consider the species the least concern, so they're doing quite well. How can you not enjoy seeing more of these roe deer? Very, very beautiful animals. Really awesome. So this was done by Leaf and Jen. They both did a wonderful job. So next we're going to go on to our next one here. We've got a remake. We have got the Gower here. So this was done by Leaf and Monsoon. Nice to see this guy coming back. So these guys are also known as the Indian Bison, and they're native to South Asia and Southeastern Asia, and have been listed as vulnerable, and their maximum population is estimated to be about 21,000 individuals. So they have declined more than 70% in the last 3 generations, and have been extirpated from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. But luckily their population is they live in well-protected areas, and they're believed to be stable or increasing. So luckily they are considered vulnerable. So these guys are the largest extant bovid. They are ginormous. So you can see they've got quite large and massively built bodies. They've got this large dewlap here as well, which is really, really interesting. And the males, you can see they're kind of a dark brown here, and the females are typically kind of more brownish. The males are typically much darker. As you can see, they're quite exposed. They've almost got like a bodybuilder cow. You can see the muscles, things like that, which is just so, so cool. And they also have the distinct dewlap here, and they've got these large horns, which males use to fight, of course. Really, really large and interesting bovid. They've also got these kind of white socks going on here, but typically they're darker and black to like brown, and the females are typically much lighter. So head to body length for these guys is about 250 to 330 centimeters, or 8'2" to 10'10", and with a 70 to 105 centimeter or 28 to 41 inch tail. and they typically get to 142 to 220 centimeters, or 56 to 87 feet tall at the shoulder. That they average at about 5'6", or 168 for females, and 6'2", 180 centimeters in male. And because of this muscular hump up here, they can get up to a little under 2 meters, or 6'7". So that just means they're quite huge. And in terms of their body weight, these guys are massive. So these guys can get between 440 and 1,000 kilograms, or about 970 to 2,200 pounds. And adult females and males, females can get up to about 1,000 kilograms, and males can get up to about 588 to 1,500 kilograms, or 1,296 or 3,307 pounds in adult males. So adult males are quite enormous. And indigo have been actually measured around that size and things like that. And some have even been suggested to get bigger than 1,500 kilograms, but that's kind of what you kind of consider for a big bull. But yeah, really, really awesome animal. I cannot love these guys. So in terms of the habitat, these guys are quite widely found across mainland South and Southeastern Asia. They can be found in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, and Nepal. Today, their range is fragmented because they typically live in protected areas. But in terms of their habitat, look at that cute little interaction there. But these guys are typically confined to. We'll have a talk about the females. So these guys are typically confined to evergreen forests, or semi-evergreen or deciduous forests. They can be found in other types of forests in parts of their range. They often live in forest tracts up to about 1,800 meters up, and they can be found in forms abundant to forage. They like places with lots of water and places with like grasses, bamboo, shrubs, and trees. So basically, anywhere they occur from sea level to and low-lying areas seem to be considered their kind of best habitat. So that's pretty cool. In Nepal, the Gar population is only about 350 or so in the mid-1990s, but it has increased to about 188 to 368 animals, which is pretty cool. So a little bit of a population increase. Their main stronghold is India, which is the Indian bison. So these guys believed to be, the population was about 12,000 to 22,000 in the mid-1990s. Though their populations, India, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, is estimated now to be between 23 and 34,000 individuals at that time. And there have been some populations here and there, like different reserves, things like that. They have healthy populations of Gar, which are of course important for tigers. But yeah, most places they're quite common in protected areas, or are just separated from each other just because they need to live in those protected areas with those forests. But yeah, really awesome. So when they're not living in areas where there's people, they can be basically diurnal, but in other areas, due to human impacts on the forest, they are nocturnal. And in January and February, these guys will live in small herds, about 8 to 11 individuals, with one of which is the bull. And in April, May, more bulls may join to mate, but individual bulls may move from herd to herd in mating with the many cows. And May to June, they leave these herds, and the males will form herds of bulls or bachelor herds, and then live alone. But females will kind of hang out. They're very matriarchal. The females will kind of hang out their own herds, and the males just come and go. And the males will also make a mating call with these clear, resonant tones that can carry for up to 1.6 kilometers, or about 1 mile. And they've actually been known to make an alarm call that's like a snort, or also a loud moo, which is pretty interesting. In terms of their feeding ecology, these guys are typically feed on graze and browse, so they're quite flexible in that regard. They eat upper portions of plants like stems, flowers, grass species, things like that. Elephant apple, leaves as well. Food preferences will change a lot because then during the winter time with the monsoons, they feed more on grasses. And then they'll also browse on leaf and shrubs as well. And other times of the year, they'll feed on different parts of things. And they typically spend most of their time feeding. They've been observed eating from pretty much 6:30 to 8:30 in the mornings and about between 17 and 18:45 in the evenings. Although during the hottest part of the day, they typically rest and sleep under the trees. And they also actually may debark trees as well, as they pretty much get, like, the bark will give nutrients and things like that, which is pretty interesting. And in terms of reproduction, these guys typically will be able to reproduce in their second or third year of life, with breeding taking place year-round, as we take a look at these cute little babies, year-round. And they typically peak since December and June. And females will typically have one calf, really two, after a gestation period of 275 days, which is a few days less than domestic cattle. And then they're typically weaned off weaned off their milk at about 7 to 12 months of age, and the lifespan of a Gower in captivity can be up to about 30 years old, so decent age. And they don't really have many natural predators due to their large size and power. As we mentioned, they're well over a ton, and these big males. But they have been preyed upon by humans, though they can get preyed upon by leopards, dhole herds, and mugger crocodiles will eat unhealthy individuals or calves. The only animals that will take on an adult healthy gar is a tiger or a saltwater crocodile that have been reported to kill them. However, the habitat distribution of gar and saltwater crocodile seldom overlap in recent times, so they used to overlap a lot more. And due to that decreasing range of both the saltwater crocodiles and the gar. And a crocodile would likely need to be a mature adult that's like more than 4 meters long and over 300 kilograms to kill an adult gar. And tigers are actually hunt young or infirm gar. Though they have been reported killing bulls up to about 1,000 kilograms or about 2,200 pounds. So pretty interesting. And when confronted by a tiger, the adult members will form a circle around the young and the calves, usually shielding them from the big cats. And the tigers will reply on ambush and taking prey as larger to gar. They're almost typically abandon hunt if they will meet any opposition. So if they avoid it, they will. They basically, if they can't get the jump on the animal, they will run off and basically just call it because they don't want to risk injury. A herd of gar in Malaysia actually encircled a calf killed by a tiger by preventing it to approach the carcass. Though these guys are pretty formidable and they can easily kill tigers in self-defense. Though in terms of their threats, most of their threats are they're highly threatened by poaching for the by trade, also opportunistic hunting for home consumption. Habitat degradation is another really big issue for these guys as well, and that's why they're considered vulnerable. The populations where they are considered increasing, and I'm sure there could be reintroduction efforts and things like that to help bring more Gowers into areas where they used to live. But yeah, really, really awesome animal, and Leaf and Monsoon really did a wonderful job with these guys. I think they look rather awesome. So last but certainly not least, we've got a cool little animal here. We've got by Gaboy and Genora Pizza, we've got the Barbary Lion. So how can you not love a Barbary lion? Let's look at this wonderful male here. So the Barbary lion, also known as the North African lion or the Atlas lion, these guys are an extinct population of the subspecies of lion Panthera leo leo, or basically the kind of North African or Indian lion, that kind of large population there. They lived in the mountains of the Barbary coast in North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, basically up until the 1960s, as we'll talk about. So these guys, as I mentioned, they're only really considered a subspecies or even a population of Panthera leo. The main ways you could tell them apart is that these guys kind of had a much larger manes, and they were also decent size as well. Head size for these guys get 2.3 to 2.8 meters, or 7 to 9 feet long, with females being about 8 feet long in head to tail length. And some manes were quite long and they extended down to the belly and elbows, things like that, which could be due to being in cooler cat habitats, which is Bergman's rule. And in the 18th century, they were claimed to be the largest lion, up to about 300 kilograms or 270 kilograms as well, or 600 to 660 pounds, though that's kind of considered questionable. Though the main reason kind of they considered the Barbary's lion to be have these big manes and things like that is likely thought to be kind of they were thought to be a distinct kind of thing in their population, so that's kind of what set them apart. But it seems that their manes actually change a lot. So these guys may have had long developed hair because of the lower temperatures of the Atlas Mountains, particularly in winter. And the factors that impact their manes include things such as testosterone, nutrition, and the ambient temperature. So it's very likely that these lions may have had these large manes just because it was colder, which is kind of similar to the extinct Cape lion, which is kind of similar. These guys are kind of at the coolest ends of their range, so that's why they had the larger manes. But they are a cool and distinct population, which is very interesting. So yeah, they're kind of considered Panthera leo. So they are considered kind of the same group of the North African Asian clade. So the Indian lions or the Asiatic lions are typically considered the same kind of subspecies as these guys, and then everything in sub-Saharan Africa is considered Leo Melachata, I believe you say that, which is really interesting. In terms of their habitat, these guys used to live around the Mediterranean forest, woodland, and scrubs, around the Atlas Mountains, and there are more regions in Algeria as well. And they, as I mentioned, they could be found in Egypt as well. And during the 1830s, these guys may have actually been eliminated from a lot of areas like Liberia because of hunting. And during the mid-1990s, the population had decreased, and I believe the last known sighting of a lion in Algeria was like 1956. And the last lion killed, as we'll talk about, was quite sad. But there also have been historical indications these guys lived in the Nile and around the Nile as well, which is really interesting. And in terms of their behavior and ecology, in the early 20th century, when they were considered quite rare, we'll have a look at the female while we'll talk about them. They were considered quite rare. There were typically signs of sightings of pairs or in small family groups with a male and a female lion with a couple cubs. And during the 1839 to 1942, sightings of wild lions were considered solitary pairs or social units. And analysis of these sightings indicate these guys were living in prides even though they were under pressure, particularly in the eastern Marib. And the size of these prides were actually quite similar to prides living in sub-Saharan habitats, with the density of Barbary lions would have been considered lower than in most of the habitats. So they kind of lived in the same groups, they just typically had larger home ranges, and plus they were endangered as well. And, oh, that's a cute little interaction there. Most commonly, these guys would have preyed upon animals such as the Barbary stag and gazelles. When they became scarce in the Atlas Mountains due to hunting, lions they have often preyed on livestock, which obviously was not good for them, and that's why they were hunted to extinction. And they also preyed upon wild boar. And these guys would have also lived with the Barbary lion, the other Barbary lion. They would have lived with the African leopard or the Barbary leopard, and also the Atlas bear, which is a really cool. We've covered it before. The Atlas bear is a population of African bears that lived in North Africa, which is really interesting. So, in terms of their cultural significance, there were obviously lots of people around Northern Africa remember these lions, and they were also used in Roman times. They were often used in these amphitheaters to hunt and things like that, which is really, really cool. Though not cool for animal welfare, but it's cool to see that they were important part of history. But that all came to an end around the mid-1960s. They believed to be in small groups, lived in Algeria until the early 1960s, and in Morocco to the mid-1960s. And that's when they became extinct due to hunting and things like that. So very, very sad to see the end of these lions. But luckily, they technically still live on. There are captive populations descended from this population. And hopefully there could be reintroductions of this genetics, at least in wild populations in the future, which I think would be rather cool, which is always really, really awesome. So yeah, really beautiful animal. You can see that long and dark mane he's got there as he plays with the baby. Really, really cute. I'm a big fan of this big lion. Barbary lions are definitely a cool looking animal. And Gaboy did a really good job at really changing the mane and make it look really, really nice. So I'm a big fan of this Barbary lion, and I'm definitely going to be supporting this. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. Just sad that they're technically extinct now. But luckily, they, as I mentioned, they do live on in captive populations, especially in Europe. And they are considered genetically the same as Asiatic lions. So you could potentially breed them with this Asiatic lions and kind of bolster genetic diversity and then try and reintroduce them to areas in northern Africa when there are other species for them to hunt, such as increases in like the Barbary stag, also boar, and potentially other populations of animals, things like that, to help basically rewild northern Africa. But yeah, really, really cool. So Gaboy did a really wonderful job of that. So I think this would be a very great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified about anything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.